Thank you all for being here. My name is Griffin McDaniel, and the project that I'll be presenting today is called The Evolution of Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron. The Decameron was published in the 14th century, and since then it has evolved into numerous different forms, and it's interesting to consider how it's changed and why this is important. So just briefly to get started, Franco Moretti in a paper describes what he calls the slaughterhouse of literature, and he says, the majority of books disappear forever. And this raises the question of why do certain books actually survive and how do they change with time? While Moretti was looking particularly at British literature in his paper, this idea of a slaughterhouse of works that are produced does exist and does hold true for works of other cultures. So the Decameron itself, as I mentioned, was written by Giovanni Boccaccio in the 14th century. Now the 14th century is particularly interesting because it was a critical point in the formation of the Italian language. It was also during the Black Death in Italy, one of the deadliest plagues in human history. Now the book takes place in Florence, Italy, and it's also written in the Florentine vernacular. So it's a sense of cultural and linguistic pride for Florentines. The Decameron itself literally means 10 days. So it's a fictional story that takes place over the course of 10 days, and there are 10 characters. Each character tells one story on each day to the group. So there are a total of 100 different stories in this book. Now, the themes of the stories range from eroticism, vice, humor, and fortune, and frequently the Catholic Church is referenced. And there are members of the Catholic Church in these fictional stories who are conducting acts that may be seen as sinful or erotic or what have you. The initial reactions to this book were mixed. On the one hand, it's been described as a bestseller. People were eager to obtain copies of it. It was very popular. But on the other hand, because of the erotic themes, people worried a misinterpretation of the work. They feared about vice, it was sacrilegious, and even some have described it as dangerous. And this really comes to light in the Counter-Reformation, particularly because there are members of the clergy involved in these erotic acts that the book describes. So in 1497, the book was thrown into the vanities bonfire along with a number of other books that individuals deemed immoral or sinful or sacrilegious. It was also placed on the index of prohibited books. It was prohibited from distribution in Italy. And because of this and because of its importance as a symbol of Florentine pride, there was a lot of pushback to have edited versions that were more appropriate. So we see a number of two, in particular, edited editions come out of the Counter-Reformation that are approved by the Catholic Church, but that are distinct and are different from the original publication. And one interesting way to look at this is to consider one story in the different publications that have come out. And the story that I'll be looking at today takes place on day 3, story number 1 of the Decameron, and it's called Mazzetto di Lamperecchio. And each story has about a 1 or 2 sentence summary, which is called the rubric before the actual story takes place. So we'll be looking at the rubrics of these stories in this analysis. So the rubric of the original edition, this is from the Hamilton 90 manuscript from the 14th century, reads, Mazzetto of Lamperecchio acts as a deaf mute and becomes the gardener of a monastery of women, all of whom rush to sleep with him. So the obvious connection to the monastery and to the church is there, and also the erotic acts of the women rushing to sleep with this gardener is there as well. So after it was placed on the index in 1564, a group called the Deputati created the first edited edition that the church then approved for redistribution. And this was redistributed in 1573, and the rubric of their version reads, Mazzetto of Lamperecchio acts as a deaf mute, becomes the gardener of a garden of young women, all of whom rushed to sleep with him. So the difference here is we've moved from a monastery into a garden. This story has been secularized and removed from the Catholic Church. Now, this secularization occurs throughout the actual text of the story and also throughout the text of the entire work. But this wasn't quite enough, as the Catholic Church put this back on the index of prohibited books just a few years after the Deputati produced this edition. So Salviati came up with the next edition, which was approved by the Catholic Church and redistributed in 1582. And his rubric reads, Mazzetto of Lamperecchio acts as a deaf mute and becomes the gardener of a seraglio of women, all of whom rush to sleep with him. So what's the difference here? Well, we've gone from a monastery to a garden and now to a seraglio. Seraglio is common in the Ottoman Empire, and it's literally defined as sequestered living quarters for women or wives. And what's interesting here is we've gone from the church to Italy, and now we've completely left Italy and we've completely left the Catholic Church and gone to the Ottoman Empire. And so we're getting just further and further removed with these later additions from the church itself, which is ultimately why the church is approving these for redistribution as they become more and more distant from the church. Another interesting thing to look at in these stories is the historiated initials. So when we consider the Hamilton 90 manuscript, which is from the 14th century, we see a free-flowing B right here that lacks too much rigid structure. Now in the Deputati and the Salviati editions, which were the ones that were censored, we see more of a rigid and structured B. And I think this is a graphical depiction and a graphical representation of what's happening with the text. We're going from something that's a little more free-flowing to something that is more structured and more order and is to what it is trying to say and to what it is conveying to its readership. And just briefly, in summary, I think this is an interesting thing to consider when we think about literary evolution. So these books and these edited versions received pretty intense criticism. They were described as vicious, damaged, lacking richness, and so on. But the important thing to consider is why they were produced. They were necessary for the survival of this book. The book is a cultural and linguistic icon for Florentines, and in order for it to survive the cultures through which it had to evolve through, it had to take this Darwinian process where only certain editions would survive. So it may not have been perfect. It may not have been exactly what Boccaccio had intended for the book to be, but without these edits and without these revisions, the book may have ceased to exist. And because of these edits and because of the approval from the church after the book was placed on the index for these new editions, the book ultimately survived what Moretti described as the slaughterhouse of literature in his earlier work. So just briefly, thank you to Dr. Martin Eisner, who helped me put together this project and do the actual research. Also like to thank the Italian department and finally the Rubenstein Library for providing the actual editions of the books which I analyzed in this analysis. Thank you all.